Who would have thought in the year 2019, just what, a few years after the departure of the first black president who got elected in 2008, re-elected in 2012 despite a tepid recovery and unpopular Obamacare? Who would have thought we'd be having a serious discussion, at least on the left, of reparations? Who would have thought that? Are you kidding me? You've got to be kidding. Reparations. There are a few problems. There are no living slaves. There are no living slave owners. That's the biggest problem. Reparations is a scheme to extract money from people who were never slave owners and give it to people who were never slaves. What about the role that Africa played in the slave trade? Without the capture and enslavement of blacks and the selling of these slaves by black chieftains, African chieftains, the slave trade never could have occurred. What about the Muslim role in the slave trade? The Muslim slave trade in Africa preceded the European slave trade by hundreds of years, continued well after, and more slaves were taken out of Africa by Arab slavers and transported to the Middle East and to South America and to the Caribbean than were slaves taken out of Africa and sent to North America by European slavers. So how are you going to factor that in? And of course, if you know anything at all about the history of slavery, slavery unfortunately has been all part of human history from the very beginning. Caucasians enslaved Caucasians, Africans enslaved Africans, Asians enslaved Asians, Native Americans enslaved Native Americans. We go on and on and on. But for the West's revulsion ultimately against slavery, we might still have it. So how do you factor that in? How do you do that? What about Kamala Harris? Kamala Harris's mother is from India. Her father is from Jamaica. Her father concedes that he and his family own slaves. How does that work? What about Barack Obama? Barack Obama's father is from Kenya. There's no evidence that his family directly owned slaves, but what is now Kenya was directly involved, intimately involved in the slave trade. And his mother, there's no question that her family owned slaves on his mom's side. So how does that work? Does Obama pay more than other blacks for reparations? What about all the people who are working class and middle class who are black? The premise behind reparations apparently is, but for slavery, but for Jim Crow, you wouldn't have the kind of poverty that you have in the black community. Blacks are about 20% poor. Whites are about 8.7% poor. How did white people get poor? Given the white privilege that they were supposed to benefit by, the trust fund that every white person gets. So are the white people who are poor exempted from having to pay any of the reparations? What about the fact that my colleague in Salem, Michael Medved, once said, only about 5% of whites have any sort of generational connection to slavery. So the other 95% who had nothing to do with it also pay? What about all the people who came over to the country after slavery was over? It's insane. And Obama even opposed slavery when he was opposed reparations when he was asked about it. He gave some long, lofty answer about, I understand why people want it, but he also said that it would be divisive, politically untenable, and he's right. It is divisive and politically untenable. Only about 26% of people right now support reparations. Who would have thought? Reparations. The Trump derangement syndrome is part of the push for this, but the other real part is, now that you have in 2020, you've got Cory Booker who's running, who's black, Kamala Harris who's running, who's black, others who are running who are not white. So if you're going to get that 95% black vote without which the Democrats cannot win, how are you going to distinguish yourself from the other people? I know. We'll offer them reparations. And so now you have Bernie Sanders suggesting that he's interested in doing that. You have Beto O'Rourke suggesting he's interested in doing that. A few days ago at a campaign stop, a black man said to him, why should I as a black man vote for you when you don't support reparations? And Beto O'Rourke gave this long answer about how poorly off blacks are, unequal, differences in net worth and all that, but he never said, I'm in favor of reparations. 2 days later, he came out in favor of a commission to study the issue of reparations, which he didn't say to that black man then. He got hammered. He knew he had to distinguish himself from the other Democrats, so now he's come around to this notion of reparations. Are you kidding me? My father was born in 1915. The man that, his name is Taisi Coates, wrote an article called The Case for reparations. It came out in 2014. It probably is the most important piece ever written about reparations, and a lot of politicians have referred to it. He starts his piece out by talking about a man who was born in 1923 and the series of things that happened to that man. He was in the military, the GI Bill discriminated against him, the New Deal discriminated, and all these bad things that happened to this gentleman who was born in 1923. My father was born in 1915. My father was born in Athens, Georgia. He does not know his biological father. I didn't find that out until I was 25 years old. We sat down and we talked for 8 hours. We had a big fight when I was 15 years old. We didn't speak for almost 10 years. So now I'm 25 years old, sitting down with my dad. I was going to call him an SOB. I figured he'd call me an ungrateful son. We'd have a 10-minute conversation. At least we'd clear the air. We sat there for 8 hours. He said, when I complained about how he used to whip us, he said, let me tell you about how I grew up. Your last name Elder? I said, yeah. He said, that's not the name of my biological father. I'm 25 years old. I said, who is your biological father? I don't know. Never met him. His mother was illiterate, had a series of boyfriends, each one more irresponsible than the one before. My dad said Elder was the man in his life the longest, which is why he took his name. And he was an alcoholic who was physically abusive to his mom and physically abusive to me when I would intervene. He was a drunk, and when he would come home from work, when he did work, he would give my mother the paycheck, my dad said, and then come Wednesday, he'd want the money, and she would refuse to give it to him because she knew he would drink it, and then he would beat the crap out of her and get the money. My dad intervened, he beat the crap out of him. That was Elder. And my dad said when I was 13 years old, he came home and started quarreling with his mom's then boyfriend. Elder was long gone. His mother sided with the boyfriend, threw my father out of the house at the age of 13, never to return. You're talking about a black boy, Jim Crow South, Athens, Georgia, at the beginning of the Great Depression. I defy you to find very many people who had a hand dealt like that. And I said, Dad, what did you do? He said, I went down the road, I took any job I could get. Ultimately, I became a Pullman porter on the trains. They were the largest private employer of those days. And my dad went all around the country, very unusual for a black boy, and he came to LA on a stop. And unlike the other stops in the South, he didn't have to get cans of tuna or crackers because you could go into a restaurant and actually get served. So my dad thought, hey, maybe someday I'll relocate to California. I don't know. Pearl Harbor. My dad joins the Marines. He was a Montford Point Marine. They were the first black Marines. For some reason, people know about the Tuskegee Airmen, but they don't know about the Montford Point Marines. There were 20,000 of them at Camp Lejeune, near where Camp Lejeune is right now. And my dad was sent to Guam during World War II, where he became a master cook. And when the war was over, my dad went back to Chattanooga, where he had met and married my mom, and he wanted to get a job as a short order cook. He went to restaurant to restaurant to restaurant, and he was told, I'm sorry, we don't hire niggers. My dad went to an unemployment office. The lady said, you went to the wrong door. My dad goes out to the hall, sees colored only, goes to that door to the very same lady who sent him out. My dad said, this is BS to my mom. I'm going to LA, I'm going to get me a job as a cook, and I'll send for you. He comes out here, he walks around LA for 2 or 3 days, restaurant to restaurant to restaurant, and they tell him, you have no references. My father said, I cook for the military. What do you mean I have no references? You have no references. My dad even offered to work for free for 2 weeks. Just give me a reference. They wouldn't do that. They treated him the same way in LA as he was treated in Chattanooga. They were just a little more polite about it. My dad went to an unemployment office, this time just one door. Lady said, we have nothing. My dad said, I'll be sitting in this chair when you open. I'll be sitting in the chair when you leave. When you find something, I'll take it. She calls him up after a day and a half. She says, I have something. I don't know that you'll want it. My dad said, of course I want it. What is it? She says, the job at a company called Nabisco Breads. You'll be cleaning toilets. My dad did that for 10 years. Took a second job at another bread company called Barbara Ann Bread, also full-time, cleaning toilets. He cooked for a family on the weekend to make additional money, and he went to night school 2 or 3 nights a week in order to get his GED. The man never slept, which was why he was cranky all the time. And as we spoke, my father got bigger and bigger and bigger, and I got smaller and smaller and smaller, and finally I'm crying, and I said, Dad, I am just so sorry. I judged you so harshly. My father said, don't be. You didn't know. But I want you to follow the advice I've always given you and your brothers. Hard work wins. You get out of life what you put into it. And Larry, you cannot control the outcome, but you are 100% in control of the effort. And before you complain about what somebody did to you or said to you, go to the nearest mirror, look at it, and say, how could I have changed the outcome? And finally, no matter how good you are, how moral you are, how ethical you are, bad things are going to happen. How you respond to those bad things will tell your mother and me whether or not we raised a man. My father is not alive any longer. If he were here and he heard this movement for reparations, he would tear his hair out. The idea that somebody owes you something who did nothing to you would just be unfathomable to him.